Is that my little gadget? Thank you. Okay.
You need that?
Yeah. Unless you can read my mind and do it for me. Okay, I'm just going to get one of these just in case. I was a preparer. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here and tell my story while it's still fresh. And this is a story I really have been in agony to tell, because I'm all, for a long, long time now, been fascinated by the stories of people whose lives have been upended by people who've had the pilings pulled from under them and everything's turned upside down, and all the props that we rely on all the time to tell us who we are and what we mean in the world just wash away. And this is a lovely quote, and I wouldn't say it's the only ideas that matter, but the truly genuine ideas for me are those that come from the place where people are truly shipwrecked, where they find themselves washed up on a foreign shore and alone and afraid and dependent upon the kindness of strangers. So when I was in Berlin, I took this picture because it reminded me that worldwide now, we have some 65 million people have been forcibly displaced. Texas just added a few 100,000 more, I think. And you know, increasingly it begins to look like maybe this is actually how it is for us. This is really the journey we're on. Or as I like to shortcut it with the younger folk, this ain't heaven, it's earth. And things happen, and big things happen, things we didn't expect. And in the Western world, we really work very hard to get predictability and stability and routine and safety. These are highly valued, but billions of people worldwide haven't ever had those things. And many people every day are thrown into a state of disruption. And this is my city, and between August 25th and August 29th, Harvey staggered along the Texas Gulf Coast like a drunk, you know, like that overly intoxicated, uninvited guest who shows up at the wedding reception and spills the drink all over everybody. That was Harvey for us, and we waited and we watched. It came ashore at Rockport, and then it proceeded to dump 33 trillion gallons of water on our coast. And there were places in Houston within a matter of hours that got 17 inches. Don't be lecturing us on that drainage stuff, and don't talk to me about zoning. It's like our mayor said, if we were a better zone city, we'd have just been a flooded better zone city. There ain't no drainage system built for 33 trillion gallons of water. And it's so nice to be here because y'all all smell so good, not like mildew. So we were sitting around watching the water rise, and me and my tribe at Baker Ripley. And, you know, Houstonians aren't real good with sitting around doing nothing. And there was a lot of nothing to do for a few days. And then I got a call from our highest ranking county official, Judge Adam, and he said, we filled up the shelters, the smaller ones and the big one, and we need a shelter to open up at NRG Center. NRG is a big center and hall right next to our sports stadium, and also right next to the Astrodome. So he said, will you do it, and how long will it take you? And I said, yes, in 24 hours. And you know, a few hours later, he called to find out how it was going. I said, pretty well. That was about 2:00. And he said, well, how about we get it open today? And I said, like the one we're in this day? And he said, yeah, we got buses and they have nowhere to go. So we said yes. And within hours, we stood up a shelter that had cots and childcare and food and medical assistance and a host of other things that people need to feel safe and welcome. And we kind of knew how to do this because day in and day out in our community development organization, we welcome people. And we welcomed them that night to the NRG Center, and we did it in 16 languages. And at one point, suddenly someone realized, oh, we forgot Farsi, and only in Houston can in 30 minutes you get more Farsi speakers than you need. 7 showed up, and we put out an appeal, but we did it. And because when we say y'all, we mean all y'all. So every last one of you. And so we did that, and we were pleased to do it, and we made it safe, and we made it welcoming. And then 2 days in, all hell broke loose because so many people in Houston wanted to volunteer. We had a 1-to-1 ratio of shelter guest to volunteer. And I had to go out and tell even the nuns that they couldn't come in that day. That was hard. But that's kind of how we roll. A lot of you have said self-organizing, and that's real fancy language in Houston. We're not fancy like that. We call it get stuff done. I cleaned that up because my staff said I can't swear anymore. I used up all my 4-letter words already. So what I want to tell you, though, is all the things I've learned from all the disasters that I've been studying, all the upheavals. I like to go around and visit those places where all hell's broken loose. And I do that wherever I can, whenever I'm invited. And really, no one ever goes on vacation with me, so it has that advantage. But Katrina taught me this. No one's coming. And that doesn't mean no one's ever coming. That doesn't mean no one cares. It means that we created institutions and processes and approaches that for a different time, and we keep refining them for the last storm we had. And when you need the help most, the first responders look in the mirror. That will be you. And when the most compelling work needs to be done, look in the mirror. That will be you. And when we can accept that, every community, neighborhood, and family that knows it's up to them will fare better than those that still believe there's somebody bigger, better, stronger, faster about to show up. So this was the Astrodome in Houston, Texas in 2005. So you see, we had a little practice. Katrina trained us to stand up a shelter quickly and welcome our neighbors. And it taught us that the systems we had relied upon weren't going to work the way we thought they needed to. And then the Syrians began showing up in Germany, and it reminded me of the connection that I saw in Katrina and now between those displaced by, I say it really doesn't matter if it's war, weather, or you've lost your wealth or your health. When life just tears you apart, from that moment on, the story is somewhat the same. So much like Katrina exposed what our wrong thinking and our slow systems for our disaster response, what happened with Syrians exposed the fact that we were operating on a refugee resettlement regime based on rules we wrote in the 1950s. But Germany stood up to welcome people. And what they learned there quickly is the same thing we learned at the Dome, the same thing we learned at NRG centers. There is enough to go around. That we turned away volunteers and we turned away donations. And a few years ago, when unaccompanied minors began arriving in Houston, we again had more families and volunteers that were willing to take them, to help them, than we had children that had been handed across the border to Texas. So we have this phenomenal capacity to care for one another. It's like right there. And we have everything we need, and we have everything they need. Everyone in Germany gave everything they had, and no one went without. The Hanseatic Help Center in Hamburg took in so much that they supplied every shelter in Germany that was welcoming Syrians. And when that was done, they began shipping it to the shelters in places like Lebanon and Jordan that didn't have as much. So you see, there's a tremendous capacity, and it's always there. It's just this latent generosity. So it's not about a shortage. It's not about a scarcity. We don't have no perfect economic system, no perfect political system, but we have the perfection of the human heart and the willingness, if we will embrace it, to know that there's enough to go around. It's not a question of scarcity. It's a question of the will and the inspiration to do it. So another great lesson I learned from displaced folks, believe me, with whom I feel quite at home, my favorite place, is that to do what you can with what you have where you are right now. And I think the people that most inspired me on that front live in one of the oldest refugee camps in the Middle East. It's in Lebanon. And these three lovely young people decided they needed a map of their camp. But, you know, they can't leave and photograph it from a place nearby. That would get them in a lot of trouble. So they took some helium balloons. They attached a camera, raised them up so they could photograph the camp from the air. And they did that because they were looking for strong roofs that were strong enough to hold planters so they could grow herbs so the women who didn't have husbands would have a means of earning an income. They're inventive and they're inspiring. And in the middle of the night, most terrifying night, when I learned that a refinery was on fire and our reservoirs were being overtopped and the water supply had gone down in my little hometown near Houston, it was these kids that were sending me WhatsApp messages to make sure I was okay. And then today, for us, sends me a message to say he graduated from high school today, so I'm quite happy for him. But there's a solidarity across the world. There's this great tribe of people that know what it's like to have everything turned upside down, to have to make it up. Then there are times when all we can do for one another is say, I'm sorry. So after the shelter was up and running, and we were momentarily congratulating ourselves and thinking, oh my God, it was so close, but we did it. The president visited. And I didn't have the opportunity in the 700,000 square foot building to cross his path. And we knew, thank God for really big buildings. So we knew that the next day he was going to announce the end of DACA. And we knew there were people in the shelter that were going to hear that, and I have staff that were going to hear that. And we knew that the dream was going to dim and die for some of the people we care most about. And sometimes all we can do is be willing to say to the people who still can't walk down the street safely, who fear being shot, who have their very right to be on the street in their own neighborhood questioned. We still have the people that can't guarantee when they get up in the morning that ICE won't have knocked on the door to take away their father or their mother. We have those people, and all that we've been able to do, for as long as we've been able to do it, we're not there yet. And as leaders, as members of the big human tribe, we have to be willing to say, I'm sorry, even for the things that we didn't directly create. We may not be at fault, but we are responsible. So we said a lot of sorries, and these are actually our families that we serve at Baker Ripley. So one thing the Syrians in Germany taught me was this. We expect people to be grateful. There were Houstonians that when New Orleanians came to Houston, we said, hey, we got you. We're going to take care of this. We're going to make a place for you here. And we did, job, house, car, everything's good. And we couldn't understand, well, some Houstonians couldn't, why everybody wasn't happy. Well, there's like food and celebration. New Orleans was built for life. It was built to celebrate life. It was built for family and food and music and dancing. And every single thing, this is what the Syrians told me, every time we go to the home that we have now in Hamburg or Berlin or Frankfurt, we think of the home we lost. Everything we look at now reminds us of what we no longer have. So life for the displaced, life for those people profoundly disrupted, everything good is also a reminder of what has passing away. It's a good lesson for us to strengthen ourselves for those times when we will have to let go of something to embrace something else. So it's important to know when to hold a funeral. When you have a disaster, everybody thinks about recovery. And recovery is a little bit of our problem. because we keep wanting to go back. And sometimes there's some folks want to go back to the memory of what they thought was there that never actually existed that they'd like to have. That, you know what I'm saying? They're just living in some kind of alternate universe. And really, what we have to do, and usually it occurs about a year after everything's turned upside down. And at about a year, we begin to realize there's no way to go back, that there's only forward. And that the funeral is not for every dream we ever had, but it's in recognition of those things that cannot be replaced. And a woman in lower ninth taught me this because she said we could not begin to work on recreating our neighborhood and community until we went to the break in the levee and we said a prayer and had a celebration and, you know, had some music too, because that's my people. And we know how to hold a funeral. And, it, you know, it ain't one of those really depressing affairs. I'm just telling you. And they did that, and it was permission to move on. So when you come to the end, to that moment when you know that what's lost is permanently gone. This is a photograph I took in Galveston after Ike. You know, there were not a lot of buildings in Galveston that were standing, but this is an old one. And somebody had hand-painted a sign on the side that said, "Hard Times and Misery Saloon." See, some people actually move into the Hard Times and Misery Saloon. Things didn't go well. It's not their fault. It's terrible, awful, and they spend the rest of their lives up on a bar stool whining. You know, that's not a good idea. So acceptance is a whole other journey because at that moment, then the way opens up. Imagination kicks in, and we have this extraordinary strength as a species of being able to create a life out of our own imagination, to actually get up and work towards something, to clear a path by walking forward. And this is an amazing talent we have. And when we will accept that that is now our work, no matter what the reason, then we can get it done, and we can go on and have an interesting life fed by the wisdom of the storm we survived. So I tell you one short Cajun story. You know, there's a lot of blame in the world. And, you know, there was at the 200th or so anniversary of when the English kicked us out of Acadia, you know, there was a big gathering of Cajuns, and we decided we'd ask them to say they were sorry, you know, and they weren't inclined to do it. So for about 200 years isn't long enough. So there was a couple of days debate on this, right? And then finally, one of my people from South Louisiana got up and said, "Why don't we just forgive them anyway and go dancing?" And remember that. That's my people. So in traveling around the world to shelters and camps and visiting with the displaced people of the world, I find that what we all have in common is these three hungers: to earn, learn, and belong. And when I was in the refugee camp in Jordan near the Syrian border, by the way, it's a city of 80,000 people that we stood up in a desert. And, you know, I say we because it was USAID, the Jordan Protectorate, the UNHCR, everybody. And people there had such pride in what they were able to accomplish. But shortly after the camp was created, people began breaking rules. They rearranged their little tents and dwellings to suit themselves. They started little enterprises and businesses and all kinds of other things against the rule. But what was beautiful about the way they embraced their neighbors in that camp was they did the right thing, not the rule thing. So if ever you're going to help, if you're ever going to show up in the midst of a disaster, of an upheaval, and work with a bunch of brokenhearted people, the most exhilarating thing about that is your big opportunity to do the right thing, So this is my sum up. This thing is saying, please wrap up. So wrap up I will. The human spirit is not extinguishable. We're terrified to look in the eyes of the people whose lives have been torn apart. We're afraid to look into murky water and see the debris and wonder who's down there, because we think if we go in to help, will we ever get out? Mostly we're just terrified we'll be one. But if ever you find that life pulls everything out from under you, you will find yourself in the company of millions of people like you. You'll have what I call storm solidarity, and it's the understanding when you look in another person's eyes and you can see the person who had to recreate a life out of their own imagination. And I invite you all to be that person, if you're still on the shore, to pull the person in the water to safety. Thank you. So. Almost finished on time. Thank you. All right.